During the muscle car years, Chrysler Corporation had a habit of building the most radical racing hardware and hiding it under some very plain Jane sheet metal, like a 426 max wedge engine in a Dodge Polara. They would then take this combination out to the local drag strip and terrorize the competition. This might not sound like fun for everybody, but if you were a Chrysler fan, it's what you lived for.
They saw the opportunity to enhance the engineering of the vehicles through racing. And of course, usually most of these guys were gearheads anyway, and they just liked racing.
When drag racing started, the excitement was centered around the open-wheel dragsters and altered coupes. Nobody paid very much attention to the handful of people who were out there racing their daily drivers. But by the early 60s, Detroit was starting to crank out some pretty fast street cars, and the drag strip was a great and safe place to blow somebody's doors off. Soon, street cars filled out two classes, one for purely stock cars and another for cars with special factory racing parts. They called this class Super Stock. By the end of the 60s, Super Stock had become drag racing's most popular class, and Chrysler Corporation owned it. Teams like the Ram Chargers and cars like the Melrose Missile and Landis Dodge are legends today, icons of drag racing's golden age. Chrysler's engineers ensured their success by coming up with one huge horsepower maker after another. These Max Wedge and Hemi engines, known by names like Red Ram, Golden Commando, Ram Charger, and Magnum, were nearly indestructible and made more power in stock trim than any other engine. When Chrysler installed these bad boy engines into their lightweight bodies, they created unforgettable race cars and awesome street machines. Herb McCandless has spent 35 years building and racing Chryslers and working with their engineers. He considers them the best in the business.
They were hands-on racers, all of them. You know, the Ram Chargers and the Golden Commando group and those people, they were all hands-on racers. That's why that program was so successful, because they knew what it took to make it work.
More than any other cars, Chrysler's Super Stockers were responsible for drag racing's incredible rise in popularity through the 60s. These cars and the people that built them and drove them created a style of racing that influenced an entire generation of street muscle cars and put a young sport called drag racing on the map.
They were just the leader of the industry as far as drag racing. They went to the races to win.
But back when it all started, it was just a bunch of good old boys on an abandoned airstrip, lining them up and running them off. We'll go there when the American muscle car returns. Drag racing was coming of age in the mid-50s, but it was still grassroots motorsports at its finest. The name of the game was run what you brung and hope you brung enough. Saturday afternoon showdowns were happening at local drag strips all over America. The age-old question of whose car was fastest was a huge drawing card for spectators and racers alike, as Ford, Chevy, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and even Studebaker were going at it head-to-head. About the only cars you didn't see at the drag strip were Chrysler products. Drag racing's first principle was power to weight, and even by mid-50s standards, Chryslers were real tanks. They did have a revolutionary new engine, though, and it could make incredible horsepower. Drag racing legend Big Daddy Don Garlitz remembers his first glimpse of this engine at the local Chrysler dealership.
My buddy and I were driving to work, and we drove by the Chrysler dealership there and had a big sign in the window, had a big V, and it said 180 horsepower. I said, Grady, stop the car. There's something wrong here. We got to go check this out. So we spun around there, went back to the dealership, went inside and said, there's a sign on the window that says 180 horsepower and a V. Has Chrysler got a V8 now? And surely that must be a mistake. 180 horsepower was, well, a hot flathead was 175. with everything on it. So how could a stock engine be 180?
They called it a Hemi because the shape of the combustion chamber was a hemisphere, a design which allowed better intake and exhaust breathing. Garlitz soon installed one of these engines in his car, but not his dragster. He put it in his tow car.
I'd gotten my hands on one for my coupe, but I only bought it to put in that coupe to tow with. I was still towing my flathead dragster behind it. So one day at the drags, I told my wife just casually, I think I'll make a time run with the 39. And I drove this little 39 coupe down the drag strip. It went 14 seconds, 114. And I knew right then, if I put that engine in a dragster, it would really be something.
Before long, the Hemi took ownership of the dragster classes as it grew from 331 to 354 and finally to 392 cubic inches. Thanks to Don Garlitz and others, there was a Chrysler Hemi in the winner's circle every week. By the early 60s, though, those stock cars were becoming as popular as the dragsters.
Superstock took a huge jump forward in 1960 at the NHRA Nationals in Detroit when Pontiac made an extremely good showing in front of the hometown crowd, which included a lot of GM executives. They saw the crowd reaction to these cars and they went, hey, we can sell cars from this.
Sell cars is exactly what Ford and GM did. The factory Impalas and Galaxy Superstockers were world beaters at the strip and on the sales floor. Finally, in late 1961, Chrysler decided to join the fun with a brand new 62 Dodge that looked pretty racy. To help them get their Superstock program on track, they called Big Daddy.
It was a beautiful red little jewel. They had taken this 413 wedge motor that they had used in the stock automobiles, and they'd put dual carbs on it. This was a car for racing.
Following drag racing's winning formula of putting your biggest engine in your lightest body, Chrysler stuffed its new 413 Max Wedge engine into the lightweight 62 Dodge Dart 330 and Plymouth Belvedere and created an instant Superstocker. Chrysler had stopped building the Hemi engine in 1958 as an economy move. They had replaced this all-world power plant with a 413 cubic inch wedge head engine. The Wedge, again named for the shape of its combustion chambers, wasn't as sexy as the Hemi, but in typical Chrysler fashion, they had a hot version of this engine. They called it the Max Wedge.
The name Max Wedge meant that they had taken the engine out to what they felt was the maximum. It was really a great piece of workmanship.
Finally, Mopar had a competitive Superstock package and a pretty nice street car as well. Don Garlitz remembers one of the nicest things about racing Superstock was being able to drive his race car to the track.
I drove it to the big drag race at Green Valley, Texas from Tampa. And my wife and I just put our luggage and all in the back and drove out there and got our motel. We went to the Dodge dealership. They put a 456 rear in it. Just jacked it up, put a whole pumpkin in there for me. I left the 331 laying on the ground, and when the race was over, we went back and put the 331 back in and drove back home. It was incredible.
The balance of power was shifting in Superstock racing. From now on, the Ford and GM drivers would have to deal with a full assault from Dodge and Plymouth. Stay with us for some Max Wedge thunder on the American Muscle Car. The 1962 Superstock season was a melee between the new Max Wedge Dodges and Plymouths and the factory-backed lightweight Pontiacs, Fords, and Chevrolets. While their competition made extensive use of lightweight aluminum or fiberglass body parts, the Mopars relied on sheer horsepower.
They completely dominated the sport. When they introduced them at the Winter Nationals in 1962, let me tell you, they were just killers. It put all of the factories in high gear, setting up special racing versions, and I mean, it got completely wild before it was over.
By 1963, Chrysler was having way too much fun to quit. Even though the 413 Max Wedge had performed well, this year, in classic Mopar fashion, it was bored out to 426 cubic inches and packed with more heavy-duty parts. The tall deck block was bored to 4.25 inches and used a stroke of 3.75 inches. With two Carter AFB 4-barrel carburetors on an aluminum cross-ram intake manifold, special upswept exhaust headers, and 10.25 to 1 compression, Chrysler rated this engine at 425 horsepower, which absolutely no one believed. These mid-sized Mopars were long on performance, but short on image. Super Duty Pontiacs and 409 Impalas could be pretty fancy cars, but the Polara and the Belvedere were about as fancy as the inside of a phone booth. These interiors never won any awards for luxury, but the car looked good enough to race. The no-frills interior also contributed to the car's skinny curb weight of 3,050 pounds. This year, the racing Mopars could slim down even more. A special lightweight racing package included aluminum front fenders, hood, doors, and front bumper. The beauty of it all was this entire car, from its aluminum nose to its 486 Sure Grip rear end, could be bought over the counter at your Dodge and Plymouth dealer. There were no back doors, no special codes, no secret handshakes. You just sat down with a salesman and ordered it, which is exactly how Dwayne Feitzer's dad got his 63 Max Wedge Dodge.
My dad bought this car new in '63. He street raced it quite a bit. My mom drove the car quite a bit. She street raced it, from what I've been told, you know.
The price tag for this ready-to-race Mopar? $3,602, which included AM radio, 2-speed wipers, power steering, and of course, the 415-horse Ram Charger engine.
One of the greatest things about superstock drag racing in that period of time was how level the playing field was. You didn't have to have a lot of money to be competitive. You just had to have the passion.
Mopar's turnkey race cars made this Walter Mitty dream a reality for more than one young race fan.
My favorite story is a guy by the name of Dick Dyke, who from Sioux City, Iowa, who at the age of 23 ordered a superstock Dodge. Took the car home, modified the rear suspension, changed the valving in the transmission, the automatic transmission, put a set of headers on it, and ran a 1232 right out of the box. He flat-towed the car to the AHRA Nationals and cleaned house. He beat everybody, and he ended up as top stock eliminator. There was no big money. Any guy could win.
Going into 1964, there was still room at the top for ambitious young superstock racers. We'll tell you about it when the American Muscle Car returns. Superstock's popularity was having a trickle-down effect on every part of drag racing. Superstock attracted racers, which attracted more spectators. More spectators attracted the big car companies, who built faster cars, which attracted more racers. In short, Superstock was the best thing that had ever happened to this little sport.
Looking back, that was a turning point for drag racing that really made it professional, because when the factories took notice and were producing vehicles just for drag racing, it gave all the other sponsors the incentive to get involved in drag racing.
And by far, to date, the best thing that had happened to Superstock, at least from a Chrysler fan's perspective, was the reappearance of the Hemi engine. After a 6-year vacation, the Hemi was back with a vengeance. Chrysler had brought it out of retirement to win races on the NASCAR tracks, but the drag racers jumped all over it. The Hemi engine caused Superstock champion Bullet Bob Reed to switch from Chevy to Mopar.
I'm sitting at Tampa Dragway one day, and Beecher Wyatt unloaded a '64 Plymouth Savoy with a Hemi in it off a ramp truck. And when he fired that thing up, my dad says, "You might as well get rid of that 409 because it's all over with."
The new 426 cubic inch race Hemi was superior to the early Hemis in many ways. This power plant used the 426 wedge block. The new Hemi heads squeezed out a 12.5 to 1 compression ratio. The Hemi also came with a solid lifter cam and a new design intake manifold mounting 2 Carter AFB 4-barrels. This new elephant motor was so strong that engine failures were practically a thing of the past.
I used to go to Cotton Owens' shop, and that's what he'd do. He'd put them on the dyno, pull the throttle back, set them at the 425 horsepower, around 7,000, and we'd go to lunch. He said, if it's running when we get back, it's a good one.
Now, with the Hemi and the Max Wedge, drag strips were playgrounds for Mopar racers. Out on the streets, though, a revolution was happening. GM's lineup for 1964 included some lightweight intermediate cars with mountain motor engines. Unlike Mopar's cars, however, these cars were loaded with plush options and rich kid image. They called them muscle cars. They had tough-sounding names like GTO and Supersport, and suddenly they were the cars young people had to have. None of them could stay with a full-house Max Wedge for a city block, but that didn't matter at the drive-in. Next to them, Polaris and Belvederes were old people's cars. Over the next 2 years, Chrysler's drag racing and NASCAR stars kept Dodge and Plymouth fans happy, while their styling department searched for that magic combination that would lure young America back into its showrooms. Finally, they found it. All they had to do was take a superstocker and load it down with class. Mopar lover Ken Marsh chose this 67 Belvedere GTX for its luxury and performance.
This car was about $3,800 with the Hemi engine option, but the GTX also had wheel lip moldings and rocker panel moldings and all the chrome and console and all the dress-up, so this was a high-end version of the muscle cars.
Cars like the 67 GTX were light, racy-looking, and as luxurious as a Chrysler Imperial. But with a standard 440 cubic inch Super Commando or the optional 426 Street Hemi under the hood, they didn't back down from anyone. But some exciting years lay just ahead for Mopar fans. The Roadrunner makes its debut when the American muscle car returns. Since the beginning of the Superstock days, Mopar's racers had been test drivers for new technology.
We found out with Chrysler that the stuff that we would test and run in our race cars would wind up being in the production cars in the next couple of years.
One of drag racing's most famous teams was Sox and Martin. Their red, white, and blue cars were synonymous with Chrysler Corporation. Ronnie Sox remembers how Chrysler used the data that he and other racers developed.
Chrysler got more for their money from what they spent in racing probably than Ford or Chevrolet ever thought about doing it. They really did a good job with it, and we would test a lot all week long, and then at the end of every test, Chrysler would mail out what they learned at these tests to all their contracted cars. I think they were smart by doing that. They really stole a lot of, especially when they came out with that Roadrunner in '68. Man, that's when their sales really started going.
The 1968 Roadrunner was, at last, Mopar's hit with the youth market. After years of making ground-shaking muscle cars, finally they hit a home run in the image department. The Roadrunner's claim to fame was speed on a budget. The car was designed to run 100 miles per hour in the quarter mile and sell for less than $3,000. On that budget, the Roadrunner featured a bed seat, rubber floor mats, and no creature comforts at all. Young people ate it up. From its cartoon decals to its beep-beep horn, Plymouth sold 46,000 Roadrunners in 1968, coming full circle back to the formula they had pioneered in 1962. Put your baddest engine in your lightest car and take it to the track. Through the years, Superstock has led drag racing in many different directions. Thanks to technology and the racer's own creativity, the factory experimental class grew out of Superstock, as did Funny Car and Pro Stock, which has become one of drag racing's all-time favorite competitions. But those early 60s Dodges and Plymouths still hold a place in many people's hearts. Today, even with all the changes in racing, or maybe because of them, the Mopar Superstockers are just as popular as they ever were. And thanks to some new technology, they're even faster.
People love these 68 cars because they wheel stand and they go fast. They're really fun to watch. They're fun to drive. I love to drive.
So whether you were there in the 60s or you're watching your first drag race today, seeing two of these ground pounders pull up to the line together is still one of the most exciting moments in motorsports, because there's just nothing else like them.
When you got a Hemi car, it's a little bit different. And I used to say, there ain't but two kind of people. People got Hemis and people want Hemis. It's just that simple. That's all there is to it.
Thanks for watching, and please remember, don't crush them, restore them.